Case 1. Amy Leann Hall. November 1st, 2018. Beggs, Oklahoma, Okmulgee County. It was a quiet Thursday morning in the rural community of Beggs, Oklahoma, when neighbors heard sounds that would haunt them forever. The unmistakable crack of gunfire, followed by screaming. By the time law enforcement arrived at the modest home on that November day, 2 teenagers lay gravely wounded, and their mother, Amy Leann Hall, stood amid the chaos she had created. The investigation revealed a nightmare scenario. Hall had shot her own teenage children inside their family home. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, battling against time to save young lives that should never have been in danger. The community of Okmulgee County, a place where everyone knows everyone, where doors are often left unlocked and children play freely in yards, was forced to confront an incomprehensible reality. A mother had turned a weapon on her own flesh and blood. As detectives processed the crime scene, they worked to understand what could drive a parent to such an unthinkable act. Neighbors described a family that seemed normal on the surface, though some recalled tensions they hadn't fully understood at the time. The investigation moved swiftly, with forensic evidence, witness statements, and Hall's own actions painting a clear picture of what had transpired in that home. Amy Leann Hall was arrested and charged with the shooting. The legal proceedings that followed brought the full weight of Oklahoma's justice system to bear. Prosecutors presented evidence of premeditation and intent, building a case that demonstrated Hall's culpability beyond any reasonable doubt. The courtroom testimonies were difficult for everyone involved. Law enforcement officers, attorneys, and community members alike struggled with the emotional weight of a mother who had violated the most sacred trust. Hall ultimately entered a guilty plea, accepting responsibility for her actions. The judge handed down a sentence of life in prison, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to harm another child. For the victims and their extended family, the sentence brought a measure of justice, though it could never undo the trauma inflicted. In the aftermath, the Beggs community rallied around the surviving family members, demonstrating the resilience and compassion that defines rural Oklahoma. Counseling services were made available, and neighbors provided support in countless ways, from meals to emotional comfort. Yet questions lingered in everyone's minds. How do we spot the warning signs? How do we prevent such tragedies in the future? This case serves as a stark reminder that violence can erupt anywhere, even in places we consider safe. It challenges us to look deeper, to check on our neighbors, and to create communities where people feel comfortable speaking up when something seems wrong. For more cases like this one, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to like this video. Your engagement helps True Crime Silent Files reach more people and spread awareness about these important cases. Case 2. Raye Dawn Smith. Death of Kelsey Smith Briggs. Lincoln County. Kelsey Briggs was just 2 years old when she entered the care of her mother, Raye Dawn Smith, and stepfather. She was a beautiful child with her whole life ahead of her, a toddler who should have been learning to talk in full sentences, playing with toys, and experiencing the innocent joys of early childhood. Instead, Kelsey became the victim of systematic abuse that would ultimately cost her life and expose one of Oklahoma's most disturbing cases of child endangerment. The story of Kelsey Smith Briggs isn't just about one moment of violence. It's about a pattern of abuse that was documented, reported, and somehow allowed to continue. Medical records would later show that Kelsey had suffered multiple injuries over time, broken bones and bruises that raised red flags with healthcare providers. Despite these warning signs, despite reports to child welfare authorities, Kelsey remained in a dangerous environment. Raye Dawn Smith wasn't accused of directly inflicting the fatal injuries to her daughter. Her crime was perhaps even more chilling in its calculation. She enabled the abuse. She knew her child was being hurt. She witnessed the injuries. She heard the cries, and she did nothing to stop it. In the eyes of the law and in the judgment of any moral standard, her failure to protect Kelsey made her culpable in the child's death. The investigation into Kelsey's passing revealed a heartbreaking timeline of missed opportunities. Child Protective Services had been involved. Doctors had documented suspicious injuries. Family members had raised concerns. Yet the systems designed to protect vulnerable children failed Kelsey at every turn, and her mother, the person who should have been her fiercest protector, facilitated her continued abuse. When Kelsey finally succumbed to her injuries, the case garnered statewide attention. Prosecutors charged Raye Smith with enabling child abuse, arguing that her deliberate indifference and active participation in covering up the abuse made her responsible for Kelsey's death. The trial was emotionally devastating, with medical experts testifying about the extent of injuries Kelsey had suffered and the timeline that showed ongoing abuse. Smith was convicted and sentenced to prison, though many felt that no punishment could truly fit the crime of allowing a child to suffer and die when intervention was possible. Kelsey's case became a catalyst for reform in Oklahoma's child welfare system, prompting legislative reviews and policy changes aimed at preventing similar tragedies. The little girl's story touched hearts across the state and nation. Her photograph, a sweet toddler with innocent eyes, became the face of child abuse awareness campaigns. Advocacy groups formed in her name, dedicated to improving the systems meant to protect children and to training mandatory reporters to recognize and act on signs of abuse. Kelsey Smith Briggs should be celebrating birthdays, graduating from school, and living the life every child deserves. Instead, her legacy is a tragic reminder of what happens when maternal instinct is replaced by indifference, when protection gives way to enabling, and when a child's cries for help go unanswered by the one person who should always answer. If this case has moved you or made you think about child safety in your community, please like this video and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going about protecting our most vulnerable. Case 3. Katherine Rutan. Murder of Logan Tucker. Oklahoma County. Logan Tucker was a young boy who loved superheroes, playing outside, and spending time with family. He was the kind of child who brought light into rooms, whose laughter was infectious, and who trusted the adults in his life to keep him safe. That trust was horrifically violated by his own mother, Katherine Rutan, in a crime so calculated and cold that it shocked even seasoned investigators. The case began when emergency services received a frantic call about an unresponsive child. First responders arrived to find Logan in critical condition, and despite their best efforts, the little boy could not be saved. Initial reports suggested a tragic accident or sudden medical emergency, but as investigators began examining the circumstances, inconsistencies emerged that turned their attention toward Katherine Rutan. The autopsy revealed the devastating truth. Logan had died from suffocation. This was no accident, no sudden illness, no unforeseeable tragedy. Medical examiners determined that the child had been deliberately deprived of oxygen, murdered by someone who held him down or covered his airways until his small body could fight no longer. The realization sent shockwaves through the investigation team. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered evidence that pointed directly to Katherine Rutan. Witness statements, forensic analysis, and Rutan's own behavior in the aftermath of Logan's death created a damning picture. Investigators discovered that there had been warning signs, behavioral changes in Rutan, and stressors in her life, though nothing that could justify or explain the murder of an innocent child. The prosecution's case was methodical and thorough. They established motive, means, and opportunity. They presented expert testimony about the manner of death and the impossibility of it being accidental. They showed the jury photographs of Logan, a smiling, vibrant boy whose life had been stolen from him by the person who should have cherished him most. Katherine Rutan was convicted of murder and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The courtroom was filled with Logan's extended family members, many of whom wept openly as the verdict was read. Some held photographs of the boy, desperate to ensure that he was seen and remembered as the child he was, not just as a victim statistic. In victim impact statements, family members described Logan's personality, his dreams, and the hole his death had left in their lives. Grandparents spoke of birthday celebrations that would never happen. Siblings talked about missing their brother. Teachers and community members remembered a child full of potential whose future had been erased. The question that haunted everyone was simply, why? What drives a mother to take the life of her own child? Psychologists who examined the case offered various theories: mental health crises, overwhelming stress, personality disorders, but no explanation could make sense of such an act. Some questions have no satisfying answers, and the murder of Logan Tucker by Katherine Rutan remains one of those inexplicable tragedies that defies comprehension. In the years since Logan's death, his family has worked to honor his memory through advocacy and awareness. They've spoken at events about child abuse prevention, worked with organizations supporting families in crisis, and fought to ensure that Logan's short life had meaning beyond his tragic end. This case reminds us why channels like True Crime Silent Files exist, to give voice to victims and to never let their stories be forgotten. Please subscribe, like, and comment to help us continue this important work. Case 4. Neha Gupta. Murder of her daughter. Connections to Oklahoma. Collin County, Texas. Dr. Neha Gupta was a pediatrician, a medical professional whose career was dedicated to the health and well-being of children. She had connections to Oklahoma through her professional work and personal history, and her case represents a particularly disturbing betrayal of everything her profession stood for. When her daughter died under suspicious circumstances, investigators uncovered evidence that would lead to first-degree murder charges against the very person who should have been most qualified to protect a child's health. The investigation began when Gupta's daughter was found unresponsive. Given Gupta's medical background, initial assumptions might have been that she had done everything possible to save her child. However, as medical examiners conducted their investigation and law enforcement reviewed the circumstances surrounding the death, disturbing patterns emerged that contradicted the narrative of a tragic medical emergency. Forensic evidence revealed that the child's death was not natural, not accidental, and not the result of an undiagnosed condition. Instead, investigators determined that the girl had been killed, and all evidence pointed to Neha Gupta as the perpetrator. The realization that a pediatrician, someone trained in child development, child safety, and pediatric medicine, could murder her own daughter added layers of horror to an already devastating case. Prosecutors faced the challenge of presenting a case that seemed almost incomprehensible. How does a jury process the idea of a children's doctor killing her own child? The legal team built their case carefully, presenting medical evidence, expert testimony, and circumstantial evidence that established Gupta's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They demonstrated that her medical knowledge, rather than being used to save her daughter, may have been employed to harm her. The trial attracted significant media attention, particularly within medical communities where professionals struggled to reconcile Gupta's actions with the Hippocratic oath she had taken. Colleagues who had worked with her expressed shock and disbelief. Parents who had trusted her with their children's care felt betrayed and horrified. The case raised uncomfortable questions about how well we truly know anyone and whether professional credentials guarantee moral character. Neha Gupta was charged with first-degree murder, facing the full consequences of her actions. The legal proceedings were complex, involving detailed medical testimony and extensive forensic analysis. For the victim's extended family, the trial was an excruciating process of confronting the reality that a mother and trained physician had taken the life of an innocent child. Beyond the individual tragedy, the case prompted discussions about oversight in the medical profession, the stressors faced by physicians, and the importance of mental health support for healthcare providers. While none of these factors excuse Gupta's actions, they became part of broader conversations about preventing similar tragedies. The victim in this case was a child who should have had access to the best possible care, given her mother's medical training. Instead, she lost her life to the person who brought her into the world. Her story serves as a reminder that danger to children can come from unexpected sources and that professional status is no guarantee of parental fitness. For continuing coverage of cases like this and to ensure these victims are never forgotten, please subscribe to True Crime Silent Files, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Case 5. Lisa Mitchell. Death of Violet Mitchell. Midwest City, Oklahoma County. Violet Mitchell was a little girl who should have been thriving. She should have been playing, learning, growing, and experiencing childhood with all its wonder and discovery. Instead, Violet spent her short life in conditions of severe abuse and neglect that ultimately led to her death and her mother's arrest on second-degree murder charges. The case came to light when authorities were called to a residence in Midwest City, a community in Oklahoma County. What they discovered inside that home was a scene of unimaginable neglect and abuse. Violet had been severely malnourished, her small body showing signs of prolonged deprivation and mistreatment. Medical professionals who examined her remains were devastated by the evidence of suffering the child had endured. Lisa Mitchell, Violet's mother, was immediately identified as a suspect. The investigation revealed that Violet's condition was not the result of sudden illness or unforeseen circumstances. Instead, the child had been systematically neglected, denied adequate food, medical care, and basic human necessities. The home environment showed evidence of long-term neglect, with conditions that were unsafe and unsuitable for a child. As detectives pieced together Violet's final months and years, they uncovered a timeline of suffering. Neighbors reported having concerns, but not knowing the full extent of what was happening behind closed doors. Some recalled seeing Violet occasionally and thinking she looked thin or unwell, but not realizing the severity of her situation. The case raised painful questions about community responsibility and when neighbors should intervene. The medical evidence was particularly damning. Violet's malnutrition was severe and prolonged, indicating that she had been denied adequate food for an extended period. Her body showed signs of medical conditions that had gone untreated. Experts testified that her death was preventable, that with proper care, nutrition, and medical attention, Violet would still be alive. Lisa Mitchell was charged with second-degree murder, with prosecutors arguing that her neglect and abuse directly led to Violet's death. The legal definition of second-degree murder in Oklahoma includes cases where death results from actions showing depraved indifference to human life, and the prosecution successfully argued that Mitchell's treatment of her daughter met this standard. The trial was heart-wrenching for everyone involved. Photographs of Violet, showing a child who should have been healthy and happy, contrasted sharply with medical evidence of her malnourished state at the time of her death. Family members struggled to understand how Mitchell could have allowed her daughter to suffer so extensively. Some testified that they had offered to help with childcare or resources, but had been rebuffed by Mitchell. The conviction brought some measure of justice for Violet, though it could never compensate for her suffering or restore her life. Mitchell was sentenced to a significant prison term, ensuring she would be held accountable for her daughter's death. The case prompted renewed attention to child welfare policies in Oklahoma County and discussions about how to better identify and intervene in cases of severe neglect. Violet Mitchell's story is a reminder of the vulnerability of children and their complete dependence on adults for survival. When those adults fail in their responsibilities, the consequences can be fatal. Child advocacy organizations have used Violet's case to illustrate the importance of mandatory reporting, community awareness, and the need for robust child protective services. In the aftermath of this tragedy, some community members have worked to ensure that Violet is remembered not just as a victim, but as a child who deserved better. Memorial services and awareness campaigns have honored her memory while working to prevent similar cases in the future. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how we can better protect vulnerable children in our communities. Case 6. Kassandra Thomas. Felony child abuse and neglect. Enid, Oklahoma, Garfield County. When law enforcement officers entered a residence in Enid, Oklahoma, they were confronted with conditions that violated every standard of child welfare and human decency. Children were found locked in filthy conditions, living in an environment so unsuitable and dangerous that officers immediately removed them and arrested their mother, Kassandra Thomas, on charges of felony child abuse and neglect. The discovery came after concerned community members reported suspicious activity and conditions at the residence. When authorities obtained permission to enter and investigate, what they found shocked even experienced social workers and police officers who had seen many cases of neglect over their careers. The home was in a state of extreme filth, with hazardous conditions that put the children at immediate risk. Most disturbing was the evidence that children had been locked in rooms or confined in ways that restricted their movement and freedom. Investigators documented the conditions through photographs and video, creating a record of evidence that would prove crucial in the prosecution of Kassandra Thomas. The children appeared malnourished, frightened, and showed signs of long-term neglect and possible abuse. Medical examinations of the children revealed various health issues consistent with neglect, including malnutrition, dental problems, and developmental delays. Healthcare providers were troubled by the extent of the children's conditions, noting that some issues suggested months or years of inadequate care. The children were placed in protective custody and received immediate medical attention and therapeutic support. As the investigation continued, detectives worked to understand how the situation had been allowed to deteriorate to such an extent. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed any previous reports to child welfare authorities, and examined Thomas's background and circumstances. What emerged was a pattern of isolation, with Thomas increasingly cutting off contact with family members who might have noticed the children's conditions and intervened. Kassandra Thomas was charged with multiple counts of felony child abuse and neglect. Under Oklahoma law, these charges carry serious penalties, reflecting the state's commitment to protecting children from harm and holding parents accountable when they fail in their basic responsibilities. The charges specifically addressed both the conditions in which the children were forced to live and the active confinement that restricted their liberty. The legal proceedings brought the full details of the case into public view. Prosecutors presented evidence of the home conditions, medical testimony about the children's state of health, and expert analysis of the psychological impact such treatment has on children. Defense attorneys faced the difficult challenge of representing a client whose actions seemed indefensible, ultimately focusing on mental health issues and circumstances that may have contributed to Thomas's inability to care for her children properly. The courtroom was filled with child welfare advocates, community members, and representatives from organizations dedicated to child protection. Many saw the case as illustrative of larger systemic issues: the need for better support for struggling parents, improved screening and intervention by child welfare agencies, and stronger community networks that can identify at-risk families before situations reach crisis levels. Thomas was convicted on multiple felony counts and sentenced to a significant prison term. The conviction ensured that she would not have custody of children for the foreseeable future and sent a strong message about Oklahoma's stance on child abuse and neglect. For the victims, the conviction represented a form of justice and validation that their suffering had been recognized and addressed by the legal system. The children in this case faced a long road to recovery. Beyond the physical health issues that required treatment, they needed extensive psychological support to process their trauma and learn to trust again. Foster families, therapists, and social workers came together to provide comprehensive care aimed at helping these children heal and develop into healthy adults despite their traumatic start. Enid community members rallied to support the children, with local organizations providing resources, donations, and volunteer support. The case prompted community conversations about recognizing signs of child abuse and the importance of reporting concerns to authorities, even when it feels uncomfortable or uncertain. True Crime Silent Files is committed to sharing these stories to raise awareness and promote child safety. Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and join the conversation in the comments about how we can all work to protect children. Case 7. Cherie Walker. Enabling child sexual abuse and felony neglect. Muskogee County. The Muskogee County home birth case represents one of the most disturbing examples of parental betrayal and criminal neglect in Oklahoma's recent history. Cherie Walker was charged with enabling child sexual abuse and felony neglect in a case that involved unspeakable crimes against children and a mother's complete failure to protect her offspring from harm. The investigation began when authorities received information about potential abuse occurring in a home in Muskogee County. When investigators looked into the allegations, they uncovered a situation that went far beyond initial concerns. Children in the home had been subjected to sexual abuse, and evidence suggested that Cherie Walker not only knew about the abuse, but actively enabled it to continue. The term enabling in legal contexts refers to actions or inactions that allow criminal behavior to persist. In Walker's case, prosecutors alleged that she was aware of the sexual abuse occurring in her home, had opportunities to stop it or report it to authorities, and instead chose to allow the abuse to continue. This made her criminally liable for the harm inflicted on the children, even if she wasn't the direct perpetrator of the sexual abuse. The case also involved felony neglect charges, addressing Walker's broader failure to provide appropriate care, supervision, and protection for the children in her custody. The conditions in the home and the treatment of the children revealed a pattern of neglect that compounded the trauma of the abuse they were suffering. The investigation was particularly complex due to the home birth aspect of the case, which meant that some of the children may not have had regular contact with healthcare providers, teachers, or other mandatory reporters who might have identified abuse earlier. The isolation that often accompanies home-based lifestyles without external oversight can create environments where abuse flourishes unchecked, as children have fewer opportunities to interact with adults who might recognize signs of mistreatment. Law enforcement worked with child forensic interviewers and medical professionals specializing in child abuse to gather evidence, while minimizing additional trauma to the young victims. These children had already experienced unimaginable harm, and investigators took care to conduct their work in ways that prioritized the children's emotional and psychological well-being. Cherie Walker faced serious charges that reflected the severity of her crimes. Enabling child sexual abuse carries significant penalties under Oklahoma law, recognizing that those who facilitate such abuse are as culpable as direct perpetrators. The felony neglect charges added to the potential consequences Walker faced if convicted. The trial proceedings were closed to protect the identity and privacy of the child victims, but court documents and official statements provided a window into the evidence presented. Prosecutors demonstrated through testimony and documentation that Walker had knowledge of the abuse, had the ability to stop it or report it, and chose not to do so. They presented evidence of the neglectful conditions in which the children lived and the long-term harm caused by Walker's failures. For the community of Muskogee County, the case was a painful reminder that child abuse can occur in any setting, including homes that may appear to outsiders to be unconventional but harmless. It sparked conversations about the balance between respecting family privacy and ensuring child safety, and about the responsibility of extended family members, neighbors, and community members to speak up when they have concerns about children's welfare. The children at the center of this case faced a long journey toward healing. Sexual abuse combined with neglect creates complex trauma that requires specialized therapeutic intervention. Child welfare agencies work to place the children in safe, nurturing environments where they could begin the process of recovery with the support of trained professionals and caring foster families. Advocacy organizations used Walker's case to highlight the importance of child abuse prevention education, particularly in communities where families may be isolated from traditional support systems. They emphasized that all children, regardless of their family's lifestyle choices or educational approaches, deserve protection from abuse and neglect. If this case has affected you or raised concerns about child safety in your community, please like and subscribe to True Crime Silent Files. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light and advocating for child protection. Case 8. Ashley Smith. Multiple felony child neglect counts. Kiowa County. In rural Kiowa County, Oklahoma, where communities are small and everyone tends to know their neighbors, Ashley Smith's arrest on multiple counts of felony child neglect sent shockwaves through the area. The case involved a medically vulnerable child who was found malnourished and alone, raising serious questions about parental responsibility and the protection of children with special needs. The investigation began when concerned individuals reported that a child with medical vulnerabilities was not receiving appropriate care. When authorities responded and conducted a welfare check, they discovered conditions that immediately warranted intervention. The child was found in a state of severe malnourishment, and the circumstances suggested prolonged neglect rather than a temporary crisis or oversight. Medical vulnerability in children creates additional responsibilities for caregivers. Children with chronic health conditions, disabilities, or special medical needs require attentive, consistent care to maintain their health and well-being. They may need specific diets, medications, medical equipment, or therapies. When parents fail to provide this necessary care, the consequences can be severe and even life-threatening. In Ashley Smith's case, investigators found that the medically vulnerable child in her care had been denied adequate nutrition and proper medical attention. The child's condition upon discovery suggested that this neglect had been ongoing, with malnourishment developing over time rather than appearing suddenly. Medical professionals who examined the child were troubled by the extent of deterioration, noting that regular medical appointments would have identified the child's declining condition much earlier. The fact that the child was found alone added another dimension to the charges against Smith. Beyond the failure to provide adequate nutrition and medical care, there was evidence that the child had been left without appropriate supervision. For a medically vulnerable child, being left alone compounds the danger, as medical emergencies can arise that require immediate adult intervention. Prosecutors charged Ashley Smith with multiple counts of felony child neglect, each count addressing different aspects of her failure to care for the child appropriately. Under Oklahoma law, neglect of a medically vulnerable child can carry enhanced penalties, recognizing that these children are especially dependent on their caregivers and especially at risk when that care is withdrawn. As the legal case proceeded, investigators worked to understand the full scope of the situation. They reviewed medical records to establish the child's needs and the care that should have been provided. They interviewed healthcare providers who had treated the child previously, gathering evidence about what Smith had been told regarding her child's medical requirements. They documented the conditions in which the child was found and the immediate interventions required to stabilize the child's health. The trial brought the community face to face with uncomfortable questions about how such neglect could occur unnoticed. In small rural communities, there's often an assumption that everyone watches out for everyone else, that vulnerable individuals will be protected by the collective awareness of neighbors and extended family. Smith's case challenged that assumption and prompted reflection on whether community members had noticed signs of trouble and, if so, why intervention hadn't occurred sooner. Ashley Smith was convicted on multiple felony counts and sentenced accordingly. The conviction ensured that she would be held accountable for her neglect and that the child would be protected from further harm. For child welfare advocates, the case illustrated the particular vulnerability of children with special needs and the importance of robust systems for monitoring their well-being. The medically vulnerable child at the center of this case required not only immediate medical intervention, but also a stable, nurturing placement where proper care could be provided consistently. Child welfare workers sought foster or adoptive families with experience in caring for children with special medical needs, recognizing that this child deserved caregivers who would be committed to meeting all health and emotional requirements. In the aftermath of the case, some community members worked to increase awareness about recognizing signs of child neglect, particularly in medically vulnerable children. They emphasized that concerned individuals should not hesitate to contact authorities if they suspect a child is not receiving necessary care, as early intervention can prevent serious harm or even save lives. This case reminds us of the critical importance of protecting all children, especially those who are most vulnerable. Please subscribe to True Crime Silent Files, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments about child advocacy and protection. Case 9. Jasmin Adina K. Brownfield. Child neglect by abandonment. Connection to serial case. The case of Jasmin Adina K. Brownfield is particularly heartbreaking because it involves not only neglect but also abandonment, and a chain of failures that ultimately led to a child's death at the hands of caregivers to whom the child should never have been entrusted. Brownfield was charged with child neglect by abandonment after leaving her children with caregivers who later killed one of them, a tragedy that shocked the small community of Cyril, Oklahoma. The story began when Brownfield, facing her own challenges and crises, made the decision to leave her children in the care of others. While parents sometimes need to arrange temporary care for their children, they have a legal and moral obligation to ensure that caregivers are appropriate, capable, and trustworthy. Brownfield's failure to properly vet and monitor the caregivers to whom she entrusted her children would have devastating consequences. The caregivers to whom Brownfield left her children were later revealed to be dangerous and unfit. While in their care, one of Brownfield's children suffered fatal abuse. The child's death sent investigators scrambling to understand how the situation had developed and who bore responsibility for the tragedy. The caregivers were arrested and charged with the child's murder, but investigators also turned their attention to Brownfield and her role in placing the child in harm's way. Under Oklahoma law, parents can be held criminally responsible for child neglect by abandonment when they leave children in the care of others without ensuring proper supervision and safety. The law recognizes that simply transferring physical custody of a child to another person does not absolve a parent of responsibility for that child's well-being. Parents must take reasonable steps to verify that caregivers are appropriate and must maintain sufficient contact to ensure children remain safe. Prosecutors argued that Jasmin Brownfield had neglected her parental duties by abandoning her children to caregivers without proper oversight. They presented evidence showing that Brownfield had limited contact with the children after leaving them, had not conducted adequate screening of the caregiver's background or capabilities, and had failed to respond appropriately when concerns about the children's welfare arose. The defense faced the challenge of representing a mother who had lost a child to violence, while also facing criminal charges related to that child's death. They argued about Brownfield's circumstances, the challenges she faced, and her intentions in placing the children with caregivers. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that regardless of Brownfield's personal struggles, she had a fundamental duty to protect her children that she had failed to fulfill. The case resonated deeply in Cyril and surrounding communities, where the child's death was mourned and questions were raised about systemic failures. How had these dangerous caregivers been allowed access to vulnerable children? Were there warning signs that should have triggered intervention? Could the tragedy have been prevented with better communication between family members, social services, or community members? For the surviving children in Brownfield's care, the case meant removal from her custody and placement in safer environments. They had not only lost a sibling, but had experienced the trauma of being in an abusive situation and then being separated from their remaining family. Social workers and therapists worked with these children to help them process their experiences and begin healing. The conviction of Jasmin Brownfield on charges of child neglect by abandonment sent a message about parental responsibility. It established that parents cannot simply transfer their children to others without taking reasonable steps to ensure safety. The case became part of legal discussions about the scope of parental duty and the consequences when that duty is neglected. Child advocacy groups used Brownfield's case to emphasize the importance of proper planning when parents need to arrange care for their children. They developed resources for parents facing crises, providing information about how to safely arrange temporary care and maintain appropriate oversight. They also worked to educate extended family members and community members about recognizing dangerous situations and intervening on behalf of children. The child who lost their life in this case deserved protection that they never received. Multiple adults failed this child, the caregivers who inflicted fatal abuse, and the mother who left the child in their hands without adequate safeguards. The tragedy serves as a painful reminder that children's safety must always be the primary consideration in care arrangements. For more true crime coverage and child advocacy awareness, please subscribe to True Crime Silent Files, hit the like button, and let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Case 10. Michelle Justus. 6 counts of felony child neglect. Muskogee County 11-year-old home birth abuse case. The case of Michelle Justus represents one of the most extensive prosecutions for child neglect in recent Oklahoma history, with 6 separate felony counts addressing years of alleged abuse and neglect in what became known as the Muskogee County 11-year-old home birth abuse case. This case exposed the dark side of extreme isolation and the catastrophic consequences when children are hidden from systems designed to protect them. The investigation began when authorities finally gained access to a home where children had been living in conditions of severe neglect and abuse. What made this case particularly disturbing was the length of time the situation had persisted. The reference to home birth in the case name reflects that some of the children had been born at home and subsequently kept isolated from mainstream society, without regular medical care, education, or contact with mandatory reporters who might have identified abuse. An 11-year-old child was at the center of the case that ultimately led to charges against Michelle Justus. This child had spent their entire life in an environment of neglect and abuse, never experiencing the normal activities and protections that most children take for granted. The child had never attended school, had limited medical care, and had been subjected to conditions and treatment that violated every standard of child welfare. When investigators documented the conditions in the home and the state of the children found there, they built a comprehensive case that resulted in 6 separate felony counts against Justus. Each count addressed different aspects of the neglect: failure to provide adequate nutrition, failure to provide medical care, failure to provide education, failure to protect from abuse, and failure to provide safe and sanitary living conditions, among others. The medical evidence was particularly compelling. Doctors who examined the children found signs of long-term malnutrition, dental neglect, untreated medical conditions, and developmental delays consistent with extreme deprivation. The 11-year-old at the center of the case showed physical and developmental markers that told a story of years without proper care. Medical experts testified that many of the child's conditions were entirely preventable and that the extent of neglect suggested systematic deprivation rather than isolated incidents or temporary hardship. Educational experts also weighed in on the case, noting that the children had been denied access to education in violation of Oklahoma's compulsory education laws. The 11-year-old tested far below grade level in basic academic skills, and evaluators noted that the child lacked not only formal education, but also the social and life skills that children typically develop through interaction with peers and participation in community activities. The psychological impact on the children was profound. Therapists who worked with them described symptoms consistent with complex trauma, the kind of deep psychological scarring that results from prolonged abuse and neglect rather than single traumatic incidents. The children struggled to trust adults, had difficulty understanding appropriate boundaries and social norms, and exhibited behaviors that reflected their years of isolation and mistreatment. Justus faced a legal reckoning that reflected the severity and duration of her alleged crimes. 6 felony counts meant that prosecutors were seeking significant prison time, and the evidence they presented painted a devastating picture of parental failure. Witnesses described the conditions in the home, the appearance and behavior of the children when discovered, and the systematic nature of the neglect that had allowed such a situation to develop and persist. The defense attempted to contextualize Justus's actions, potentially arguing about mental health issues, beliefs about parenting and education, or circumstances that contributed to the situation. However, prosecutors successfully argued that regardless of personal beliefs or circumstances, parents have non-negotiable duties to provide basic care, and that Justus's failure to meet these duties constituted criminal neglect. The trial was lengthy and emotionally draining for all involved. Child welfare workers who had investigated the case testified about what they found and the immediate interventions required to stabilize the children's physical and emotional health. Law enforcement officers described the scene they encountered and the evidence they collected. Medical and psychological experts provided detailed testimony about the harm the children had suffered. For the Muskogee County community, the case raised troubling questions about how such extreme neglect could occur unnoticed for over a decade. In an era of increasing awareness about child abuse, how had these children remained invisible to systems and communities designed to protect them? The case prompted discussions about the balance between respecting family privacy and autonomy versus ensuring that all children receive minimum standards of care and protection. Justus was convicted on multiple counts of felony child neglect and faced substantial prison time. The conviction represented accountability for years of harm inflicted on vulnerable children who had depended entirely on her for their survival and well-being. For child advocates, the conviction was an important precedent, establishing that extreme isolation and deprivation of children will be prosecuted vigorously under Oklahoma law. The children at the center of this case faced an enormous challenge in recovering from their experiences. Having spent their formative years in conditions of severe neglect, they required comprehensive, long-term support to address their physical health needs, educational gaps, psychological trauma, and social development. Child welfare agencies worked to place them in therapeutic foster homes where specialized care could be provided. Educational specialists developed individualized plans to help the children acquire basic academic skills they should have learned years earlier. The 11-year-old, in particular, required intensive remedial education to catch up to peers. Teachers and tutors who worked with these children marveled at their resilience and capacity to learn despite their traumatic backgrounds, while also acknowledging the significant challenges they faced. Mental health professionals emphasize that recovery from this type of extreme, prolonged neglect is a marathon, not a sprint. The children would need years of consistent therapy, stable placements, and supportive relationships to develop healthy attachments, process their trauma, and build the coping skills necessary for successful adulthood. Some would likely carry emotional scars throughout their lives, though with proper support, they could still lead fulfilling lives. The case became a catalyst for policy discussions in Oklahoma about monitoring children who are educated at home or born outside traditional hospital settings. While the vast majority of families who choose home birth or home education do so responsibly and provide excellent care for their children, Cases like Justus's demonstrate the potential for extreme isolation to hide severe abuse. Legislators and child welfare officials grappled with how to protect children's welfare without unnecessarily intruding on legitimate family autonomy and choice. Some advocacy groups proposed measures such as mandatory wellness checks for children not enrolled in traditional schools, required registration of home births with health departments, or periodic assessments by social workers for families with minimal institutional contact. Others worried about government overreach and the potential for such measures to unfairly target families making legitimate choices about education and healthcare. The debate continues, with Justus's case serving as a sobering example of what can happen in the absence of oversight. For the 11-year-old child who was central to this case, life after removal represented both opportunity and challenge. For the first time, this child experienced what most of us consider normal childhood experiences: regular meals, medical and dental care, schooling, toys and books, and relationships with caring adults. Yet each of these experiences also highlighted what the child had missed and the gap between their development and that of typical children their age. Foster parents who care for children from such backgrounds describe the complex mix of emotions these children experience. There's gratitude for safety and care, but also grief for lost childhood, anger at the adults who failed them, confusion about why they were treated so differently from other children, and sometimes even conflicting feelings about their biological family despite the harm they suffered. Helping children navigate these emotions requires patience, professional support, and unconditional positive regard. As the years pass, the children from this case will continue their healing journeys. Some may maintain no contact with Justus, choosing to sever ties with someone who harmed them so profoundly. Others might eventually seek understanding or reconciliation, trying to make sense of their experiences within the context of family relationships. There is no single right path forward, and trauma therapists emphasize that each child must be allowed to process their experiences in their own way and time. The broader community of Muskogee County was left to reflect on the case and its implications. Some residents wondered if there were warning signs they had missed or whether they could have done something to identify the situation sooner. Others questioned whether systemic changes were needed to prevent similar cases. Still others struggled simply to comprehend how such extreme neglect could occur and persist for so long. Child welfare organizations have used this case in training for mandatory reporters, helping teachers, doctors, neighbors, and others understand the importance of reporting concerns even when they're uncertain. They emphasize that professionals are trained to investigate and assess situations, and that it's better to report a concern that turns out to be unfounded than to remain silent when children are suffering. The case also serves as a reminder that child abuse and neglect occur across all socioeconomic levels, geographic areas, and family structures. Rural and urban communities, wealthy and poor families, traditional and non-traditional households, all can harbor situations of child maltreatment. Vigilance and willingness to act on concerns are necessary everywhere, not just in settings that fit stereotypical profiles of at-risk families. Justus's conviction on 6 counts of felony child neglect stands as one of the more significant child welfare prosecutions in recent Oklahoma history. The case demonstrated the state's commitment to holding parents accountable when they fail to meet even minimum standards of care. It sent a message that extreme isolation of children will not shield perpetrators from legal consequences when abuse or neglect occurs. For the victims, justice through the legal system was only one component of their healing. They needed and deserved comprehensive support, medical care, education, therapy, stable placements, and caring adults who would commit to their well-being for the long term. The community, child welfare system, and legal system all played roles in providing these children with opportunities to recover and rebuild their lives. This case exemplifies why True Crime Silent Files is committed to telling these stories, to honor victims, demand accountability, and raise awareness about child protection. Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with others who care about child welfare. Your comments and engagement help spread awareness and can make a real difference. We've journeyed through 10 of Oklahoma's most disturbing cases of maternal betrayal, stories that challenge our understanding of the bond between mother and child and remind us that the greatest dangers to children sometimes come from within their own homes. These are not abstract statistics or distant news stories. These are real children who suffered and died or survived with deep scars because the people who should have protected them instead harmed them or allowed harm to continue. Amy Leann Hall, who shot her own teenage children. Raye Dawn Smith, who enabled the abuse that killed little Kelsey Briggs. Katherine Rutan, who suffocated young Logan Tucker. Neha Gupta, a pediatrician who murdered her own daughter. Lisa Mitchell, whose neglect and abuse led to Violet's death from malnutrition. Kassandra Thomas, who kept children locked in filth. Cherie Walker, who enabled sexual abuse in her home. Ashley Smith, who neglected a medically vulnerable child. Jasmin Brownfield, who abandoned her children to dangerous caregivers. And Michelle Justus, charged with 6 counts of felony neglect in the Muskogee County home birth case. 10 cases. 10 mothers who violated the most fundamental duty of parenthood. And many more victims, some who lost their lives, others who survived but carry the trauma of their experiences. These cases force us to confront uncomfortable truths. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Danger to children exists in communities that consider themselves safe and family-oriented. Professional credentials, middle-class respectability, and conventional appearances provide no guarantee of moral character or parental fitness. And perhaps most importantly, children depend entirely on adults, parents, family members, neighbors, teachers, healthcare providers, and others to recognize when they're in danger and to act on their behalf. What can we learn from these heartbreaking cases? First, that we must never hesitate to report concerns about child welfare to appropriate authorities. If you suspect a child is being abused or neglected, contact your local child protective services or law enforcement. You don't need absolute proof. Trained investigators will assess the situation. Your report could save a life. Second, we must support robust child welfare systems with adequate funding, training, and staffing. Many of these cases involved some contact with child protective services or other agencies, but interventions were insufficient or came too late. Systems designed to protect children must have the resources and authority to do so effectively. Third, we must create communities where children are visible and valued, where isolation is discouraged, and where all adults feel responsible for the well-being of all children. The phrase, "it takes a village," is more than a cliché. It's a recognition that child protection is a collective responsibility. Fourth, we must provide support for parents and families in crisis before situations escalate to abuse or neglect. Mental health services, parenting education, economic assistance, substance abuse treatment, and other supports can prevent tragedies when offered early and accessibly. And finally, we must never forget the victims. Each child in these cases was a unique individual with their own personality, dreams, and potential. They were not just statistics or case numbers. They were Kelsey, Logan, Violet, and others whose names we may never know, but whose lives mattered. By telling their stories, we honor their memory and work to prevent future tragedies. The mothers in these cases have been held accountable through Oklahoma's criminal justice system. They have been convicted, sentenced, and in most cases removed permanently from positions where they could harm children. Justice, to the extent it's possible in such cases, has been served. But no legal penalty can truly compensate for a child's suffering or lost life. The best we can do is remember, learn, and act to protect the children who are with us today. To everyone watching, thank you for taking the time to hear these difficult stories. Awareness is the first step toward prevention, and your willingness to engage with this content, as disturbing as it is, demonstrates your commitment to child welfare and safety. This has been True Crime Silent Files, dedicated to giving voice to victims and pursuing justice through awareness. If you found this documentary valuable, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our coverage of important cases. Like this video to help it reach more people, and share your thoughts, reflections, or resources in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue this crucial work. Together, we can create a world where children are safer, where abuse is recognized and reported promptly, and where every child has the opportunity to grow up healthy, loved, and protected. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay vigilant and stay informed.